seconds or so to make sure everyone's in, and then we'll get started. All righty, let's get this kicked off. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Dealing with Grief and Loss in Your Juvenile Drug Treatment Court. And this is a little bit of a heavy topic today, but we do feel like it's a necessary thing for teams to think about and for you to plan for. The webinar today is going to deal with both kind of how to help people handle their emotions and how to work with your own emotions, and then also kind of the logistics and practical side of things to be prepared. If you lose a participant in your program or a staff member, how are you planning to deal with that? I should let you all know today that our presentation is the opinion of the presenters and does not represent any official position of either the federal government or the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. All right, so with that said, now I want to get us started. We've asked a couple of folks who are practitioners in the field to talk to us a little bit about this and what they've done in their programs and how this could look for you. So I'm going to turn it over now to our two presenters, Brent Vaughn and Rosalind Thomas. Roz and Brent, take it away.
Hey, well, good morning, good afternoon, depending on what part of the country that you're actually in. My name is Rosalind Thomas, and I've actually worked with at-risk youth and families in various roles over the past 20 years. I specifically have been working in collaboration with court teams and community partners to launch creative and innovative projects to help implement evidence-based practices in drug courts. And so I'm very much so looking forward to this very important webinar today, brainstorming with you and talking about this very important subject matter for all of our JDTCs.
Thanks, Roz. Hi, everyone. Good morning for me. I'm coming in from Oregon. My name is Brent Vaughn. I am a juvenile drug treatment court provider here in Lane County in Eugene, Oregon. I've been serving in that position for the last 8 years, and I share Roz's appreciation for being able to be here today and discuss this topic with everyone. Kind of following up to what Jessica said, fairly obvious to those that are seeing the title of our presentation today, but just want to make sure everyone knows that what we're talking about could bring up some challenges for folks, and make sure you're taking care of yourself however you need to while we go through today.
We have 3 objectives for our webinar today, which is, of course, on the topic of dealing with grief and loss in your JDTC. These are 3 objectives that we have. Number 1, we want you to walk away being able to describe expected responses and ways to support JDTC participants and staff following a tragic event. We also want you to understand the specific roles of JDTC staff following a tragic event. And then last but not least, we want you to be able to identify policies and procedures to address programmatic responses that should be in place in your JDTC following a tragic event.
So the reason we're here today is I don't know most of you. I might know some of you who are here today, but what I might be able to guess about a lot of you being involved in this profession is that you are very compassionate and empathetic people who really care about your job and the people you work with. And as you know, the people that we work with, the people that we serve is really a high-risk population, and that's who we want to be serving. But what that often means is that they are engaged in some pretty dangerous behaviors and activities. That might include really risky substance use, violence, being involved with weapons. So there's just a lot of risks that the participants we work with might be exposed to, which then means that you as a staff member, compared to many other jobs when you're working in juvenile justice and in JDTCs, you are unfortunately at a much higher risk of experiencing the death of a current or a former participant in your program. And so we want to be here today because our feeling is that planning ahead will really help you be able to better support everyone that's impacted. So that includes yourself, your team, the participants and families, as well as the family who unfortunately experienced the death of their child. So we're going to cover a lot of those areas today, but we think this is a crucial area for people to receive some training in and make sure their courts have a plan around responding to. I also want to say that as we go through today, if some questions come up, I think you're encouraged. There should be a Q&A box where you can put some questions in or in the chat, and we will have some time at the end to make sure to answer those. Before we delve into the topic too much today, I do want to kind of start with a check-in with everyone who's here. We're going to talk about a very hot topic that I'm sure all of you maybe been to some trainings about or see all over social media, but that is around self-care. And the definition we're working with today is that self-care is anything you do on your own to maintain or improve your physical, spiritual, mental, and emotional health. As you can imagine, it will tie into the topic we'll be discussing today. So to get us started, we're just going to do a little activity where you can list some of the ways you practice self-care.
All right, and we're going to use Slido for that today, folks. So we're going to either go to slido.com or you can scan this QR code that's up here in the top left corner. And when you get there, you're going to enter in our code, which is 221479. And again, we just want to know, what are some ways that you practice self-care? We think it's a good idea to start out today talking about that and sort of holding that in our minds as we do this. So again, you can scan the QR code there in the corner and enter in 221479, or you can go to slido.com. All right, and it looks like people are finding it. Great.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Seeing some answers come in. Physical activity, I think one might see a lot of examples of different types of physical activity that you appreciate doing. I always like questions like this when you get to see unique answers. The short road trips, taking drives for someone sounds like a practice for self-care, which can allow for that time for reflection. Dancing, going to the beach. Here in Oregon, we have access to the beach, and it's just where I'm at, just about an hour drive down the road, even though it's not something to jump into. It's nice to be there.
I like time with my nieces and nephews too. I think spending time with people who we love can really help us recenter ourselves, and spending time with small children can often just take you way out of your own head because you're really dealing with them and where they're at.
I saw a good one too about time for reflection. For me, anything with water, if I can find the nearest lake, I'm good. That's a great self-care practice that I implement often. Going to water, something very calming about that for me.
Oh, there's one of my personal favorites up there, disconnecting from social media.
That's a good one, yeah.
I think in this time, I don't know if folks have heard of doom scrolling or just stepping away from that phone. Social media can be really helpful for self-care.
All right, well, thanks everybody for participating. I'll turn it back over to you guys, the screen. Oh, we've got one more coming in. Puzzles, we have a puzzle table here at NCJFCJ in our kitchen. And we just recently reinstated the puzzle table after we had some COVID restrictions. And when I'm feeling stressed out about whatever report I'm writing, I go in and I put a couple of pieces in the puzzle and it really helps recenter me. So I agree, puzzles are excellent.
This is really motivating me, Jessica, because I actually bought a puzzle during the pandemic and it's sitting in a cabinet. So maybe I'll take some time and pull that thing back out and start that as a potential way to practice some self-care. All right, so now we're going to go a little bit further in our presentation, and we're going to talk a bit about some experiences from the field. So I'm going to reshare my screen again. And I just wanted to take a moment and actually share a little bit about some of my experience in the field. And hopefully this is a way for you all to really start seeing some policies, procedures, and strategies that we can really implement within our JDTCs across the country, regardless of where we are and where you're logging in from. For me, I think one of the vivid memories that I have is my first reaction of hearing the news that we actually had a loss in a JDTC. And I remember that this particular participant had actually started responding to treatment and services, and I actually anticipated would actually successfully complete the program. Unfortunately, breaking curfew, being at the wrong place at the wrong time really led to a series of unfortunate events. When I found out about it from the JDTC staff, my heart literally sank. I think the first thing that I recall was just feeling very numb when I heard that news. It was almost like a flat line. I just didn't have any emotion. The next thing that came up for me personally, experiencing that, hearing that, was I really went through a point of denial where I started to think this can't be true. Maybe they've identified the wrong person. And then the next thing that started for me was actually I started a process of internalization. I started asking myself questions like, why did this happen? What more could I or others have possibly done to prevent this? And I remember after I went through these series of emotions and internalizing, I went home later that day and I sat down and really got quiet, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And literally, I just started crying hysterically because I just felt so powerless in that moment. And it was something that I could not have planned for, something I really didn't see coming. And it really led me to start processing this experience in a different way a few years later and really start asking a different type of question, which is what can JDTCs do to really support fellow staff members, JDTC participants, and also the family of the youth who has been impacted by the loss. I think that type of questioning really led to where we are today for us to really start talking about as practitioners in JDTC courts about what is it that we can do, how can we prepare, how can we be a support to the youth and the participants who are left remaining in the program. One of the things that I really did learn is that everyone on a team, when they hear the news of this, they process differently. I internalize, I think others may have more so externalized as far as their process. One of the things that we'll be talking about later in our presentation is that there really isn't a right or wrong way to process grief, but I really do believe one of the powerful lessons that I've learned from my experience in the field is that being in community, particularly with your JDTC staff, being able to not process alone, but having a support system which starts with your team, and of course that can go beyond into personal support that you have, I think is going to be so crucial and key. It'll be a theme along with some other themes that you'll be hearing during our presentation. And one of the things that we'll be sharing with you today is not just facts and different things along those lines, but the practicality of how do we process, what can we do, how can we prepare when something unfortunate like this could actually happen, and really preparing ourselves as well to make sure we have a strong support system. I'm wondering how often this could have happened for some of you in the field. So we're going to actually do just a very brief poll, and we would love to hear from you, for you just to share when that poll comes up on your screen, for you to take a moment and respond on, has your JDTC experienced the death of the current or past participant? Whether it's been in the past year, the past few years, the past 5 years, and for you to be able to answer and also let us know how often maybe this has happened. For us to try and get a poll, one of the things that we tried to do or tried to gather information for in preparation was to find out, was there any research in the field as far as data points that had been collected? And we weren't able to find any. So we're kind of starting our own data pool to start polling as we're doing presentations in settings like this to find out. So let's see if our poll pops up. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We have 88% of those of you who are on with us have experienced the death of a current or past participant. And for the second question, we see that the majority of you have answered 1, some even said 2, 3, and there's a small number here that have actually experienced the death of 4. Brent, what's your thoughts about that? And I know this will lead into you talking about grief and how it affects us as JDTC staff.
Sure, I appreciate everyone for being willing to complete that poll, and Roz for being willing to share about an experience that kind of relates to today. To me, I think it kind of validates why we felt like it was important to be providing a training of this nature. Looks like a lot of people have experienced a death sometime within the past 5 years of a participant. And unfortunately for a few folks, it looks like that's occurred more than one time in the last couple of years. So it was kind of like you were saying, I don't know that we can find exact data if you look across the country, but my intuition is that this is unfortunately a common experience. So making sure that we are prepared to deal with this situation is very important. Before we get, as Roz indicated, part of what we are going to do today is really talk about what are some specific steps your team might want to do to respond, to support each other, to support the participants. But before we do that, I wanted to just take a little bit of a zoom out, do a foundation of kind of looking at just a brief 101 of what grief is, and kind of what are some common ways that people might respond to grief, what kind of reactions people might experience, just as that might help inform some of the responses you would have later as you're coming together with your team and hopefully thinking about this. So grief at its most basic level is just a natural response to a loss or a death. It's something that everyone is going to experience if they are connected to a death. And as I said, we're going to talk about some common reactions, but the really one important thing to know is there's no normal, quote unquote, normal way to grieve. The way you might experience it could be very different in terms of the time frames in which you experience different emotions, the intensity to which you experience the process of grief. So just keep that in mind that no two people are really going to experience it the same way. Meaning that grief is really a relative or a subjective experience. And what that means is, for some folks, the death of somebody may have a pretty minimal impact on their life and their functioning, their job, their family, how they're interacting in the world. But on that spectrum, there's also people that might experience traumatic grief, which is really a type of response that can be really debilitating to your functioning, to your ability to meet your responsibilities. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but that's something we really want to be attentive to in the participants that we work with. As you know, a very, very large, if not all of the participants we work with have some sort of trauma history, meaning they might be more likely, they also might be really connected to the person who died. So their response could be very traumatic to this death. But either way, there's quite a large spectrum of responses to grief. Just to go over a few basics, so there's shock and disbelief. That's initially will occur where it really feels like it's not real, kind of like out of body, like this isn't happening. There's some emotional responses that you might be pretty familiar with, just sadness, some anger, guilt, depression. Physically, you might see things such as extreme exhaustion and tiredness, or sleep disturbances on the other side, like inability to sleep. A lot of times people will complain of headaches, stomach aches, body aches in general. That's kind of a way that pain might reveal itself in physical symptoms. And then behaviorally, of course, crying is a natural response to grief and sadness. Might also look like withdrawing. There's a lot of variety in terms of the behavioral responses that people might experience. So that's kind of a basic overview. Next, we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at how it might affect the staff in your program in a JDTC, and then we'll take a look at the participants. But first, if you look at the staff, again, like I was saying, it's most likely to affect staff members differently. I think Roz alluded to this in the example that she was sharing, but that might be based on a few different factors. Different staff members have a different relationship to the participant who died. They might have their own, well, they certainly will have their own personal history with death and loss and how that's impacted them in their life, and that can come to the surface when a new experience happens. Then just there's your general personality or disposition, as Roz was alluding to, in terms of internalizing, really, doing a lot of thinking, but not expressing a lot of what you're feeling. And other folks might have a lot to say about how they're feeling and what's going on. As a program, I think and this is something that, I've become aware of through my work in the juvenile justice field in general, and just from hearing other people's examples. But when something really extreme and traumatic like this occurs, I think as a staff who cares so deeply about our participants, a lot of times we may have feelings of fear, inadequacy, anger, or failure. Questions, I have some questions that, for example, that might come up. Did we do enough? Was there some sort of intervention that we were missing? What were we missing in this situation that we could have done about this? Could we have had this person in a safer place? And I really do feel that these are very valid responses, and they come from a place of a significant amount of caring. Again, because that's why we do the job that we do. But it's just something that's really important that we maintain our awareness about, and we consider how this might be impacting the way we are continuing to do our work. And if we're really feeling as if that it's really sticking with us, it's being persistent, we're really bothered by it after hours of work, it's something we're struggling to not think about. We're going to talk about it, but really it might be time to make sure you're seeking additional support, because that's what it's there for. So Roz, if we can, I'm going to move and start talking a little bit about the different types of support.
Sure.
Thank you. We're going to start with just tips for team support. I think Roz mentioned like feeling part of a community can be really important. I mean, it's just important because aside from this type of situation occurring, the work that JDTCs do is difficult in general. So I think having that sense of community is really important. But after a death of a participant, you really want to ramp that up. So one of the things that we would recommend is that you provide an opportunity for your team to share their thoughts and feelings. You're probably initially going to have a meeting where this is really the information is shared. That might be a space to talk about it. But you also might want to provide that space in individual check-ins that you're having with your colleagues, maybe not in a group setting, but just when you're calling to check in about another participant, you might say, hey, how have you been doing? How are you feeling? You want to encourage self-care. Everyone listed a lot of those. If you hear, maybe share an example of self-care you're doing with your team to kind of model that. You might consider holding an informal team gathering. We've always found this to be really important in our team, like, maybe a potluck, a barbecue, a meeting at a restaurant of some sort, just to kind of be outside of that work setting and get to know each other in different ways and talk about maybe other parts of life. And then whatever other unique ways you can think about supporting your fellow team members. I love coffee. I would probably, someone bringing me a coffee, something special like that, just to say, hey, I'm thinking about you, whatever way you might be able to help them out or support them. Besides team support, there's also some more specifics that we should look at in terms of professional assistance that you want to make sure you're aware of as a team member of a JDTC. So that would be looking at like your employee assistance programs, what your health insurance covers. So for professional therapy, again, I might be a little biased as a therapist myself, but I think that can be incredibly valuable. You want to do that before it's in a crisis or an emergency situation. So I think, the earlier you can try and get some support, it can be helpful. Your supervisors, I think for the most part, I don't know all of your supervisors, but if there's someone that you really feel supported by, they often have more years of experience in the field. Maybe they can speak to you about something they've gone through that's similar. So supervisors can be a great resource. And then an idea of peer mentors. This was something that I became informed about kind of recently. I don't know that it's something I've ever found in the treatment field, but I believe within law enforcement and probation, oftentimes there's kind of a network of other probation officers, maybe outside of your place of work. So maybe within your state or others in your county, that you could connect with almost on a slightly more anonymous level to just kind of talk about. And again, everyone would kind of be in agreement to be a member of that, but that can be another valuable resource. Personally, I think people alluded to this, connect more with your friends and family after an incident like this occurs. consider taking some time off, time away from work, self-care, whatever hobbies and activities you enjoy doing. And then, like I said, therapy. And there's also usually community support groups. I believe if you were just to Google whatever your city or town name is, grief group or grief support, you could probably find lots of options. And if there's not some in person in your town, one of the things that has come from the pandemic is certainly that there's all kinds of online resources where you could probably attend and get some help there too. Importantly, today, we want to make sure we look at moving beyond staff. We want to look at the impact this can have on participants and their families. So for the youth that we work with, a lot of what I was already covering in terms of the emotional responses, they might have a lot of anger and guilt. There could be some anxiety. A lot of times, I think what we might notice in the youth we work with is a sense of recklessness or apathy, like kind of what's the point? If this is what happens, I don't care. I don't want to do things. That can be a common experience. Some of the same physical difficulties. Mentally, we're talking about trouble with focusing, memory, problem solving. A lot of racing thoughts or rumination can occur. I'm going to skip the maladaptive behaviors. I'm going to come back to that for just a second because I think it's really important we spend a little time with that. But keeping in mind too, as a court, that are the parents and the caregivers of the youth we work with. My experience has been as a treatment provider, when I talk to families, parents after this, they have a really intense, heightened, anxiety and fear that a similar thing could happen to their children, which is not, I validate that. It's a totally understandable response. But we also need to know, and I think you probably know this about the families you work with, that occasionally they might not have the ability to provide the appropriate emotional support. The way it might look is that fear translates into just wanting to get, tell their kids, stop doing what you're doing, and the same thing's gonna happen to you. Those types of responses are understandable, but often not what is gonna help our youth kind of move past this in the healthiest way. But so I wanna go back to maladaptive behaviors. If you're looking at that list there, you'll probably notice them as the behaviors that JDTCs are constantly, that's what we're working with. Those are the behaviors we're wanting to change. And so we're talking about substance use, aggression, rule breaking, not attending school, not attending counseling appointments, which, yes, not attending counseling appointments, which we can really feel a strong feeling about. And, right after this, we could think, you need to go to therapy, you need to go to therapy. But a lot of times kids are they're not going to react in that way. So I think as a team, we just need to recognize that after an experience, a death of a participant, we really might observe kind of an increase in these behaviors. And we should certainly still continue to respond to them as a court like we always would, but maybe just keeping an extra place of compassion and patience when we're doing our staffings, and trying to keep this in mind and know that, it may take some time for people to get back to the level of maybe progress they were making prior to an incident like this, especially, and you're going to know if your courts are similar to ours, the relationships that your participants have with one another. Sometimes more than you'd like to know, but you might know who might be significantly impacted, and really trying to help them get support. So just keeping that in mind in staffing as you're moving forward, not just the week after, but probably for weeks to follow an incident like this, or even months. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's all I have to cover on that slide. If you have questions around that, again, please put those in the chat or the Q&A, and hopefully we'll have some time to cover that at the end. I just kind of want to wrap up on the next slide here about some general recommendations about supporting folks in grief.
Okay, my wonderful world of technology, my screen has frozen, so give me one moment. Brent, go ahead and I'll catch up to you. I may have to reshare, but keep going. I may have to reshare.
Understandable, I can do that. Always Zoom making things difficult.
Yes, the wonderful world of technology.
After 2.5 years, we'd have a perfect system down, not quite. But I kind of was sharing about ways to support staff. So this is a little bit more about just supporting those in grief in general. And what that might look like is you really want to be present to the experience, reaching out and checking in. Talking about death, I think, is something that's really difficult for us to do in general, and especially within our teams. But rather than trying to kind of pretend, I think there can be a tendency to want to pretend, especially when we're meeting with our coworkers or kind of to avoid it. But it's really a time you want to just reach out and say, hey, how are you doing? This occurred. This was really serious, and I just want to make sure, I want to know how you're doing, how I can support you. And in caps locks here, you'll see that I have listen, therapist says listen, but really, I think it's a time that's super important to listen to what your teammates are saying about how they're feeling, and the youth that you work with really bring out what validate whatever feelings that are coming up. They might be, oh, I'm fine, and note that, even if you might feel like, oh, you're probably really not fine. It's not looking like you're fine. But if you're listening, you're just saying, okay, I'm glad to hear you're fine. You really want to express that you care. I know that's kind of a given, but really making sure that people, the youth that you work with, know, hey, I care about you. I want to make sure you're doing well. I want to make sure you're safe. Accept that tears are normal. Crying is normal and healthy. But if you're not, if someone is not expressing their grief in that way, that's also okay too. But just be ready to accept both ways. And you really want to be cautious about assuming you know how someone is thinking or feeling about an experience. I mean, I just alluded to, the relationship sometimes of different participants. So, but you still want to be careful about, just because two are close, that you know exactly what they're going through. There's some cliches that I think we say in our culture that are not always super helpful. They come from a good place, but they kind of come from that assumed place that you know what's going on. So I'm sure you guys can think of a few, but this person's in a better place. You're so strong. If someone's not feeling that way and it doesn't align with how they're feeling, it's really not a very helpful statement, but it's a really normal thing for us to want to do to help people feel better. So again, just asking how people feel and asking how you can help, I think are crucial. And again, this is for your team as well as the participants in your program and the parents.
And so now we really want to talk about developing a cohesive response. I really want you to think about the roles that you have on your JDTC team. We're going to talk about that in a little bit in depth. And I want you to be thinking about how every team member has a very unique role as well as a unique perspective that is really needed for you to form a cohesive response for when things like this happen or could happen in your JDTC. You want to develop a preemptive plan. You want to use those staff roles as a guide. You want to hear from everyone, and that plan should really respond to the family who have experienced the loss as well as the participants in the program. I really wanted us to highlight this because we want to not only respond to the family who experienced the loss, but we want to think about the participants who are remaining in the program, the support that they need, maybe some extra treatment that they may need, things along those lines that are going to not only support them immediately after something like this happens, but even in the days ahead. I think often about when I've had a transition in my own family in the past year or so, how we get all of the support. We hear from everyone immediately in the aftermath, but also thinking about when people continue to show up, when people continue to offer support, when people continue to check in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days out, how it is really a network and a safety net, not only for families, but when things like this could happen in the JDTC as well. So I want us to be thinking about that as we look at the following slides. When we think about the role of JDTC team members, of course, all of you, I'm sure, have been involved in varying degrees of training, whether you've attended as a team, a training that has taken place on a national level, or maybe, especially during the pandemic, you've been engaged in attending trainings that have been offered virtually. We've had a lot of those that have been such a support to us during the pandemic. We've been trained about our specific roles in the day-to-day operations of drug court in the areas of incentives and sanctions, case management plans, treatment plans, pro-social activity structures, and the list goes on and on. But I want us to make a slight shift and expand upon this about what our respective roles actually looks like and how they actually should and can evolve when we experience grief and loss in the JDTC. So what we've done in this section of the PowerPoint is that you'll see in this slide and the few more that are to come that we've listed some of the traditional roles that we have in JDTCs. I want you to be thinking how for some of you, some of your team members may be serving in a dual role. So when you're thinking about maybe your role, if you're a judge or coordinator or you're a treatment provider logged on the webinar today, maybe you're serving as a dual role as a coordinator and an education liaison, or you're serving as the treatment provider and the family support. So I want you to hone in not only on your role, but other roles and those individuals on your team and what this could look like in your JDTC. A cohesive response, let's start with the judge. When something happens like this in the JDTC, we want the judge to really provide overall guidance to the team on the next best steps for a cohesive response. We want the judge to really be a spokesperson of resources that are available. And then that really leads into the role of the coordinator. The coordinator, we want them to implement, guide, and oversee this cohesive response amongst the team members. We'll talk a little bit later about how that can actually take place in the form of a meeting. Also, the coordinator can serve as a librarian of community resources that address grief and loss. If you're a coordinator, or if your coordinator is not on the call today, I want you to start thinking about, do we have a resource folder or a digital file where we're collecting community resources specifically along the lines of grief and loss? So we have it available for our participants, and we also have it available for fellow staff members who may need to access that in addition to support from the treatment provider on the team. And then we look at the probation staff. We're particularly thinking of your probation officers. We want you to really monitor youth in your caseload for any triggered responses from this traumatic event. You know, Brent mentioned it earlier about certain behaviors that we could see an uptick as a result of this grief and loss in the JDTC. And so you really want to be thinking about how you're implementing your incentive and sanction structure in light of this event that has just occurred and some behaviors that you may be seeing that are actually a triggered response. You actually want to be a cheerleader. I didn't put that here, but you could be a cheerleader to the youth and families to utilize resources and keep other team members abreast of referrals and observations that you're making or you've observed or things that you've seen, particularly informing treatment to make sure that they're engaged in assisting in an ongoing trauma-informed response.
Yeah, thanks, Roz. I think I'll, being that my role as a treatment provider, I'll cover this part a little bit. Your treatment provider is obviously, as you know, your primary source of therapeutic support for the individuals in your program and their families. So really they should be handling the, whatever types of therapeutic responses you're going to have. As a treatment provider, you would want to be able to provide support kind of beyond if you normally meet with the youth once a week or once every other week. You'd want to be willing to meet with them, or hopefully have the ability and space to meet with some youth twice a week if needed. Other youth, you just want to make it offered, but you're not going to, I don't think as a court you'd want to force it necessarily, but just make sure you can make it offered for those who desire it. And again, you would want to make sure you can facilitate referrals for maybe if there's really specific mental health counseling, something that feels outside of your scope of practice, making sure that you're making those referrals to the youth. And most importantly, that you're letting the families know of those referrals. Because I think a lot of times, especially after something like this, youth might lose track of that type of information, but really making sure a parent or a guardian is aware of those resources and referrals. And you mentioned earlier that some of you may be in a dual role. We at our court don't really specifically have a family support facilitator or group facilitator, but your treatment provider might offer to have essentially kind of a processing meeting with families that are still involved with youth and families. It wouldn't be looked at as a required thing to do. I'm thinking, a couple hours on like a weekend, and it would be announced in court. And just say, hey, this is a space to talk about how you're feeling, how you're doing with this. It was really significant to our team, to everyone here. So again, you might offer a space for that. And then maybe your family facilitator would think about, oftentimes giving support in a time like this is really, really helpful for processing. And so if the families or participants want to think of a way to offer support to the family who experienced the loss, I think that could be a role of a treatment provider or a family support facilitator.
Mm-hmm. And then we look at the education liaison. I do realize that all JDTCs do not have a dedicated person on their team who is an education liaison for them. So this could be another dual role. The coordinator could be serving as an education liaison, or as I've seen in some JDTCs, you can see the probation staff or probation officer serving in that dual role of communicating with school officials, dealing with ensuring that the youth is engaged in school if they're not enrolled when they're starting in your JDTC. But whoever on your team, whether it's designated or you have that dual role scenario, you want to think about what that function would be if you did have that, which is to document and report the incident to school officials, connecting the family with school for support if relevant. And then we have the ADA and PD. That's your assistant district attorney, your public defender. You want them to be engaged in this process in your cohesive response as a team, to really inform the team of any legal considerations for staff and other participants pertaining to the incident, including any ongoing investigations, especially if the incident could possibly or potentially involve other participants. So you can see, just looking at these various roles, how everyone has a particular lens or bend as far as what contribution they can make, and really making a cohesive response when grief and loss, unfortunately, could happen in our JDTC, which leads into policies and procedures. How do we respond as a program when something unfortunate like this happens? So now we're kind of looking into the nuts and bolts of what we can actually do. What's our takeaway from hearing information like this in a webinar today? Number one, schedule an in-person or virtual meeting with all team members. These are some ideas of what you can begin to think about incorporating as a policy and procedure. I think is helpful that all JDTCs have a policy and procedure manual. And if you don't, hey, this is a good place for you to start, not only building a component or a section for grief and loss in JDTC, but getting and putting in writing, documenting how we're going to respond to this. Review staff roles for a cohesive response. I want to go back to the first point here, schedule an in-person or virtual meeting with all team members. When something like this happens, I think it's important that we don't go to phone, or we don't go or depend on email communications to communicate this type of event. I think when something like this happens, it's best if you can call an emergency meeting, whether it's in person or virtual, together as many team members as possible, so that you can communicate what has occurred. I think you're going to see more support, and you're able to develop a cohesive response when everyone, as many as you can gather, are there at the same time to hear that news, process it together, and then think about how can we be a support to the participants and the family who's experienced the loss. Secondly, review staff roles for a cohesive response. We just went through some things that you can consider to put in writing and document for these particular team roles we just talked about. Designate specific tasks and responsibilities to individual team members. That may be talking about who's going to reach out to the family who's experienced the loss. You may have 10 team members, and you don't want 10 team members calling this family who has experienced the loss all at one time. Who's going to lead the charge? Maybe it would be the treatment provider coupled with the probation, who has the most interaction or closest relationship with that family. So you're brainstorming and thinking about what approach would be best. Another task could be, okay, we have an upcoming treatment group, or maybe we don't have one, but we maybe want to schedule a special treatment group session for our youth, for them to be able to process their emotions, process what has happened, and for us to see how we can support them. Next will be individualize a plan for the family who's experienced a loss, followed by consider possibly maybe canceling court or pro-socials following the incident. Maybe right after this incident happened, you had court or you had a pro-social schedule, but you haven't had an opportunity to schedule an in-person meeting with your team for you all to process, and then for you to think about how we want to support our participants and how we want to communicate, what to communicate, and maybe some things we shouldn't communicate, to observe maybe some legal implications or other things along those lines. When you're meeting, you want to have someone who's your note taker to document, and also schedule periodic follow-ups and check-ins. And once again, something Brent mentioned earlier, we want to ensure all JDTCs staff are receiving the support that they need. Here's some tips that I want you to think about for developing a policy and procedure. I can't say it again, schedule a meeting. I probably have worn this out in the past 2 or 3 slides, but I can't overemphasize how important it is for you to connect with your team. You want to review the role of the JDTC team members we just covered. So we're going to share this PowerPoint with all of you who've signed up for you to be able to take this PowerPoint, and if all of your team members weren't on today, you'd be able to go back and sit with this presentation and process this with your team. You want to review the prior slide, a programmatic response, document in writing what steps and measures your team may put in place. While you're doing that, remember there's no cookie cutter approach for responding to the death of a participant, but you want to have some type of plan in place, and you want to periodically revisit those policies to ensure they are effective and that they're actually comprehensive, and change them and adjust them as needed and necessary. Brent, I think I rode through so quickly. Is there anything you wanted to share or add to this before we transition into our next slide?
Yeah, thanks, Roz. I'll just add a little bit before. I think we're going to have everyone have an opportunity to kind of brainstorm some of the things based on what they just learned around these responses. But really touching on what I said earlier, there's really no normal way that people are going to experience grief. And that's kind of why we're saying that there's not really a cookie cutter approach. It's not going to, you might have noticed on the slide before with the programmatic response, there's not a ton of specific call family 24 hours later. Do this, because you need to be flexible. And I really encourage teams, and even with the roles that we described, these are ideas. I think these are general themes that you want to think about, but you know the makeup of your team, you know the makeup of the participants that you work with. And so you really want to use that knowledge, that knowledge you have that we really don't know much about your programs, to create these procedures and policies. But some of the pieces around having that team meeting, writing these ideas down, and coming up, like developing a plan, that should be in writing. So I hope that kind of makes sense. There's going to be some pieces that unfortunately, if this occurs another time in your program, you might not do the exact same thing you did the time before, because you just need to be really responsive to and individualized to the given situation. So I think that was the only piece I wanted to add to that, Roz. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's great. Really getting that in writing and thinking about how we're going to respond. You could take what we've shared with you as far as those roles and saying, okay, this is what we'll do. Treatment provider will implement maybe, a special group, if needed. Coordinator is going to share the digital file with the team to remind them of resources available to refer. Judge will make mention of this at our next court hearing. So you're just writing down certain things that you're looking at implementing, and then making it customized and individualized for the needs of that particular youth and family. I've even seen JDTCs where they have a family support facilitator who gets involved somewhere in the process, where they support that family. If the family maybe needs food, or if there's like going to be a funeral service or different things like that, I've seen even team members show up and support that family. And so these are just some ideas for you to think about ways that you and the team can show up for the family, some things that can be put in place, some things that can be tweaked and adjusted as you go. Brent, there was an awesome link that you were going to share. Would you like to share about that? You're going to put it in the chat for teams to have access to it. It was a document or a file.
Yeah, you know what? I think let's move on to the activity. And while that activity is going on, I'll get that posted in the chat, and then I'll share a little bit about it, because I got to make sure I can pull it up again. Thank you for that reminder.
Okay, perfect. So now we're going to do a little bit of hands-on today and think about what we can start, stop, and continue doing. So for this activity, we're actually going to solicit your participation based on what you've heard, for you to be able to type in and start thinking about, what do we need to start doing as a team? What do we need to stop doing? What do we need to continue doing? And so Jessica is assisting us with Slido today. So that's the first question, which is, what do we need to start doing as a JDTC? What are some things you heard today, some things that got your mind, got you thinking? What do we need to start doing? It may be, we need to develop a policy and procedure for this, or we need to hold a team meeting ASAP. What are some things that stood out to you?
Yep, so we're going to go to slido.com again, or we're going to scan the QR code. I think if you scan the QR code, it's probably still in your phone, and this will appear. And we're going to put in the number again, 221-479, And we do want you to share something that you might stop doing, something you might start doing, or something you might continue doing. So if you have experienced loss, and I mean, when we looked at that poll we took earlier, 88% of folks that are participating today have experienced a loss. And so maybe you did put some things in place at that time. And so maybe there's some things you want to share that you're going to continue doing. But maybe you do want to start some things. And so this is, again, a place where we want to hear from the audience about what you're doing or what you might start doing.
Here's one: schedule a meeting from our loss last week. Oh, so this is recent. Okay.
My heart goes out to you. That's terrible that you just lost a participant. We're here for you.
Yeah, whatever we can do to support you. I'm hoping there were some things we shared that may be of help, and let us know how we can support. Okay, here's one. I like there to be better team care when we lose a youth. Absolutely. Start a team meeting. I would say put it on the calendar. In the next 7 days, get with your team. Don't let May come and you didn't schedule a meeting. So that's a great one. That's a great start. Absolutely. What about some things to stop? I see a few things for start. What about some things to stop doing, or some things that you're already doing that you think you want to continue?
Meet with the team to develop a protocol. Yeah. I think one of the reasons we wanted to do this webinar is because what we see from kind of the training and technical assistance side is that teams kind of, I don't want to use like the term caught flat-footed, but that's what comes to mind, is that because there isn't a plan in place ahead of time, anytime there's a loss, everybody feels like they're a little bit scrambling, trying to figure out what to do and what's the right thing to do. And so I think having these conversations before you have the loss is one good way to get you there.
Oh, this is a good one, Jessica and Brent. Be able to share your thoughts and feelings. Now, you heard me share a little bit, being transparent early in the presentation. I internalize, so I'm a thinker. I think and I process quietly, but there comes a point where it can reach a boiling point where I need to share and process out loud. So I think having that space, a safe space to do that, whether you have that personal support, but then also finding a way to do that with your team members as well. I think that's important.
Absolutely. I just wanted to add to what Jessica was saying, the flat-footed idea. You know, I think this is a difficult meeting to have. And we all know there's a lot happening in our programs that we're always trying to adjust to the new best practice and make sure we're following a lot of other protocols. But this is a really, it's an important meeting to have. And I kind of mentioned some of the ways that it's more difficult to focus and problem solve and deal with things after we experience grief and loss, which is why trying to do this immediately following an event can just be extra challenging. And so if you can have that plan, even as difficult as it is to kind of sit down and do, we think it's really important.
Mm-hmm. I think a phrase we used earlier in the presentation was the word cohesive. Something you just mentioned, you know, Jessica and Brent, is that it could be difficult to have that meeting, but I think it is important that you try to have it, that you do have it, just because everyone can be going in so many different directions that we're not cohesive and we don't know what this already has been done or this needs to be done. And so when we're unified, I think we're stronger together, we're more effective. Oh, this is a good one. Lean in with compassion and support in a non-punitive way. So we want to be mindful when we see certain behaviors that could have been triggered by this event in our participants. We want to make sure that we take a non-punitive way and be mindful of that.
Great. And I'm kind of noticing that we have about 5 minutes left. I think if I'm seeing the time right. Yep. As Roz mentioned, there was a resource I wanted to share. So I'm going to put that in the chat really quick for everyone. This resource is it's a really great one-pager. It's tips for caregivers. So that might be parents or professionals for helping teens with traumatic grief. So I had mentioned that earlier, that a lot of the youth we work with might experience traumatic grief. So let's make sure. So if you go there, there's a little one-page download you can get. There's actually a ton of excellent resources on this website, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, to look through. But I find this one pager really helpful in terms of some specific recommendations on how to be supportive. But I'm not sure if there's some questions for Q&A or if we're other pieces we need to wrap up today, Jessica.
Yeah, so Brenda, it looks like you just shared that resource with just us. So when you click on the drop down, can you share it with everyone instead of just us?
How about that?
That looks perfect.
Perfect. Right. So any questions and answers? Oh, go ahead.
I haven't seen any questions come in yet. If folks have a question and you want to get it in here just as we're wrapping up, you can put it in the Q&A box or into the chat. I do really appreciate you guys being willing to share the PowerPoint, because you have laid out some nice kind of tips and the ways that people can approach this and make a plan. And so we will send a link to the PowerPoint out when we send the recording notice out to folks. And I really do appreciate you getting on and talking about this hard topic today. So we're waiting to see if we get any questions. Another minute or so, or comments if folks want to have a comment. Or if you wanted to talk out loud, you can raise your hand and we can call on you. You can unmute. All right. I'm going to, while I pull up the link for the evaluation, I'm going to let you guys have your final thoughts, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I just really want to appreciate everyone for being here today. And again, you saw the title of the webinar, and so there might be some feelings like, oh, I don't know if I want to be there for that. But again, it's very important. Hopefully, I think Roz said schedule a meeting. I think people picked up on that, Roz. It sounds really important. If you can, do it sooner than later while you're thinking about it. And as Jessica mentioned, this slideshow should be available. So with some of those specific recommendations that you could take into that meeting.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's been great being here with you all. I'm hoping everyone had a takeaway today, and looking forward to continuing to hear about the great work that you're doing in your JDTCs, and to continue to be a support when something unfortunate like this happens in a JDTC.
All right, great. Thank you both so much. So for folks who would like to give us some feedback on today's webinar, and I hope that's everyone, you can follow the link that I put in chat, or it's now available via QR code, which is so cool. So you can scan the QR code that is on your screen right now and respond to those questions in the evaluation. It helps us, again, know how we're doing and make choices about future webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Tune In Tuesday. We will have another Tune In Tuesday in June, and you'll be getting information about that shortly. And we're going to be talking about normalizing adolescent behaviors and really making sure that we in the court system are helping kids meet regular milestones and those rites of passage, like going to prom and getting a driver's license, and how we can make sure that we in a JDTC program don't stand in the way of those kinds of things. So we'll be talking about that next time in June. We'll see you then. Otherwise, thank you all so much for participating, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.